Okay. So as I was saying, that the purple bullet there, the last one, they're using the ACPF as part of a strategy for evaluation and adapting your watershed planning and implementation approach. So looking at actual practice implementation compared to the opportunities identified with the ACPF toolbox. Moving along a little bit more quickly here, we just wanted to share with you, because each of you in your states and NRCS, whether you're working in a state or across states, you know, those state specific contexts are different. So what we did here is just map out for one state, Wisconsin, how the ACPF fits in with state goals at the state level, how we deal with watershed management at the HUC 8 scale, the HUC 12 scale-ish, or HUC 10, you know, those smaller watershed scales, and the farm field scale, the different tools that ACPF needs to integrate with at the state level. In Wisconsin has a couple of specific tools, eval and snap plus, that we use. So that means that ACPF fits differently in how we do watershed planning than it would in your states. And we just have some ACPF applications, how those ACPF applications fit at each of the different scales. And those scales, of course, would be consistent with working with different audiences as well. So again, I'm not going to go over this in detail, but wanted to show you, I think this way of helping people in your state understand how ACPF fits in with other tools can be helpful, you know, for you and for the people that you're working with. And we'd be happy to consult with you on putting something like this together. So the NRCS is currently providing quite a bit of support to continue developing and advancing the ACPF in the Midwest and across the US, which we're very excited about. So we also put together a couple of graphics that look at watershed planning within the very specific context that NRCS programs and policies are working in. So again, we're just sharing this with you because you all work with NRCS and because it just shows another model for how the ACPF can be applied in a different context. In this case, you know, it's NRCS is calling it area-wide planning and their in their 9-step conservation planning process. So even before, you know, you see those pre-planning bullets up above, even before you're going into the NRCS 9-step conservation planning process, you know, you're going to want to determine whether any ACPF analysis has already been done for the area that you're intending to work. And then, as we've talked about, identifying potential partners and to begin building relationships ahead of time so you can determine and agree upon how the ACPF might help as a tool, might help accomplish your shared goals. And we're going to, you know, talk quite a bit more about this during the session today. So NRCS divides up this planning process into 3 phases. So phase 1 is collecting and analyzing information, and you know, having the ACPF outputs available, if those are available. Again, working with partners to identify priorities and resource concerns, using the tools to more identify those concerns and opportunities in more detail. And then, as we've talked about and will continue to emphasize, you know, before going out to do field verifications, ACPF can make it your job more efficient before, you know, to identify where those opportunities are likely, so you can prioritize before heading out into the field. One thing about this graphic I think that is also helpful is looking at, you know, how you might use the ACPF at the watershed scale. This map is more explicit about bridging the watershed scale. So in phase 2, you're going to be running the ACPF practice tools to generate a watershed-wide catalog or a menu of suitable alternatives. And then in phase 3, when you're applying and evaluating, that's when you might do more generation of farm scale maps. And you know, depending upon the person that you're working with or your audience, you know, you may want to bring both types of maps along with you, or you may not. You know, you heard in some cases you may not want to show any maps because that might not be something that someone you're working with is interested in at that point, or it may raise more concerns than it does help. So that's, you know, something that's up to you. But for you, having those 2 scales of maps might be helpful in differentiating the uses of those different kinds of maps. And then I'm not going to spend any time on this, but I did want to include it in this presentation just to show you again the differentiation. What we did for NRCS is differentiate how we would use the ACPF in area-wide planning in comparison to how we would use the ACPF at the farm or field scale. And so this farm field scale graphic is just getting to the finer details of how you might apply the ACPF in a farm scale or field scale walkover with a client. So that is a summary from me, and I'm looking forward to the conversations today, and thanks so much for your time.
Great. Thanks, Rebecca. So I'm going to share my screen and talk to everybody a little bit about how, just some tips and tricks about communicating ACPF, some considerations that you should sort of consider when communicating ACPF, and sort of some best practices for that type of information. All right. Is everybody seeing my screen all right? Excellent. So my name is Emily Usher, and I am at the Natural Resources Social Science Lab at Purdue University. So pretty much today, we'll be talking about how applying ACPF to conservation planning and implementation. So that's kind of what Rebecca was just talking about. We'll talk about sort of the primary users of ACPF, sort of additional ACPF uses, or what I like to call extracurricular uses, and some considerations, some communication guidelines, and then I'm going to share some examples of maps at a various scale, and sort of discuss how they are appropriate or not appropriate to a particular setting. So like Rebecca said, ACPF does a lot of work with conservation planning and implementation. The ACPF is a decision support tool that is used to inform conservation planning and implementation, and can be applied at both watershed and field scales. So like Rebecca was just saying, it can help create maps that inform priorities and can help decision-making, as well as help with implementation. So it kind of has the full gambit from collecting and analysis, decision support, and implementation. So in conservation planning and implementation, the primary users that we focus on are conservation partners, and of course, the private individuals and communities that are working in the areas that we are focusing on. So some of the sort of conservation partners that the ACPF that are users of the ACPF is so NRCS and Soil and Water Conservation District staff. And at the watershed and field scale, these field office staff really have the local understanding of the watershed and the people in their community. So their existing relationships and knowledge, both of the biological and physical knowledge of the area, as well as the social knowledge of the area, is important for outreach and planning information. So there's also a lot of other federal, state, and local agencies who have an interest in water quality improvements on a state as well as watershed scale. And they can provide technical, operational, as well as financial support to communities and other conservation partners working to improve water quality in their area. And the third sort of conservation partner that we've identified are partner organizations. And this is really a catch-all because partners are truly integral to the success of ACPF. And I think that Tuesday's case studies that were shared really kind of set the stage and really highlighted how important they are, and gave us some great examples of the roles that partners can play in applying these ACPF results. And I just want to say Marcel made an important comment towards the end of Tuesday's discussion that sort of highlighted each state had a different partner, and sort of those partners contributed in different ways. So in the Iowa case study, it was spearheaded by a private partner, so the Iowa Soybean Association. In Indiana, they had a conservation innovation grant from the NRCS. They also worked with the university as well as the Environmental Defense Fund. So they had, government, they had agency help, university participation, as well as private from the EDF. And the Minnesota case study was sort of spearheaded by the state agency. So in each of those examples, each watershed had a unique makeup of partners and sort of the way that those partners contributed. So I thought that that was a great example. Just wanted to highlight that. So as we know, in working in conservation, we have to work with private individuals and communities who are working in these landscapes, managing, making decisions. And really, these are the folks that are the ones that are putting these practices on the ground. So the folks that we've kind of identified as important people in this area is community leaders. So the community leaders are people in the watershed who are influential to their community. So these could be folks on the Soil and Water Conservation District Board. This could be someone who owns a large portion of the watershed or farms a large portion of the watershed, or simply someone that people look to for advice, information, or leadership. So these folks are sort of, they can influence folks in the watershed and have played an important role in sort of promoting different practices and different initiatives. So another important partner are the landowners and farmers in these areas. So these are the people that are actually on the ground making the decisions on their property that they own or manage. And these folks would be the recipients of sort of the outreach that watershed managers or conservation folks are working to reach, as well as hoping that some of these folks adopt some of these practices. And finally, we have just the general watershed community. So this could include both agricultural and non-agricultural related folks in the community who have an interest in improving water quality. So kind of focusing on sort of pulling from these examples from the case studies and sort of this sort of outline of some of the different partners that we have. I just kind of want to start, pose this question, sort of like maybe start a little bit of a discussion that can continue throughout this presentation of who are the partners in your area. So I know that we have a couple different states here, and I just am wondering what are some of the partners that you guys see, and are there any that you feel like are particularly unique to your area? I actually cannot see the chat, so I'm not sure what people are saying, but we will be able to discuss these responses if we have any in a little bit. So, and another thing that we'll be doing today is sort of doing a participatory exercise. So this can also be discussed during those and kind of getting yourself in this mindset of sort of sharing your experiences and sharing some information about your watershed. So another sort of extracurricular uses of ACPF, a lot of these were highlighted by our case studies. So the first one is sort of pre-planning resources or training resources. So Kevin had mentioned from Minnesota. So pre-planning can sort of provide some information to conservation staff that can really improve the efficiencies of their work by helping them to prioritize and focus on areas that are most beneficial or important to focus on at both the field and watershed scale. So this just kind of gives folks, it's essentially kind of doing your homework. So you're able to sort of understand what the concerns are, what the potential concerns could be. And there's also some social considerations. So understanding sort of that, that landscape, the biological and social landscape of all of this. So that's a pretty important thing that also sort of these local folks, the Soil and Water Conservation District, or people who understand the area sort of have that information. The second sort of extracurricular use of ACPF would be enhanced outreach. And I know that Carl, our Wisconsin and Iowa examples sort of mentioned that ACPF can help prioritize outreach related to specific practices in specific areas of the watershed. So for example, if the ACPF identifies the western portion of your watershed to be particularly suitable for wascovs, while the eastern portion is more suitable for stream bank stabilization, you can kind of prioritize those specific practices, prioritize your outreach in those specific practices in areas that they are best suited. Sort of another element of the ACPF really kind of promotes watershed thinking. So it helps put a field in the context of a watershed, and sort of like emphasizes that nested relationship that fields have within their watershed, and can help increase both individual and communities' understanding of how the practices and management decisions that they make on their fields impact their watershed, as well as communities upstream and downstream. Sort of the fourth sort of extracurricular use of ACPF is it can be used to help identify opportunities for multi-landowner projects. So it kind of provides an in to sort of start this discussion, and sort of it can help give people highlight areas that could be a really great partnership and really have big impacts on the ground. So those are sort of the extracurricular uses. And then there's also a couple different considerations that you kind of have to think about when communicating and sort of running the ACPF. So the first is field verification. And I kind of understand this field verification as being twofold. So the first, it is important to make sure that you're actually documenting and verifying the presence and the quality of existing practices. So you want to understand what's on the field, because that then impacts how you would then make future decisions. And the second is that ACPF really is a non-prescriptive practice citing tool that can suggest existing practices or practices in a less than ideal location. So for example, it might suggest that you put a constructed wetland a little too close to your house or in your side yard. So you really kind of have to critically look at these outputs and sort of use the context of the watershed and your understanding of the area to sort of verify that these practices are appropriate in those actual areas. So when working with producers or landowners at the field scale, proper field verification is pretty important to building trust with those folks, and can really help increase their perceived validity of these practices and confidence in the practices that the ACPF has sort of identified or cited. And the last consideration that I want to talk about is privacy. So although the ACPF uses publicly available data, privacy and protection is really important to NRCS and conservation partners, as well as the individuals whose data is, who are valuing their own data. So when sharing ACPF outputs, really need to make sure that personally identified information of those landowners and producers is protected. And this kind of comes into play when sharing outputs, and really kind of depends on the scale of which you share those maps publicly. So just kind of keep that in mind. So I'm going to share a couple communication tips, and then in the example maps that I'm sharing, I'll kind of have these little icons pop up, and you can kind of, we'll be able to talk about sort of where, how these considerations and sort of extracurricular uses take place. But so just some general tips about communicating these information, communicating ACPF outputs. Audience is really important. You have to know your audience and understand who you're talking to, and be able to tailor your message. And this is a pretty fundamental information for communicating anything, and it applies to ACPF as well. I really appreciated Joe's sort of analogy of the ACPF as, in his example, the Soil and Water Conservation District executive director really played an important role in gathering the support for the project, and her understanding of the local and physical landscape was valuable. So she understood her audience and was able to sort of tailor the information to appeal or really resonate with the folks that she was working with. And also internal communication between conservation partners can differ from the way that you communicate to the public or even to an individual. So you really want to kind of tailor your message, tailor your maps, and be able to sort of change, not change, but just tailor. the maps to your audience. The second is the phrase target. We want to stay away from this phrase. We want to avoid that phrase. So when communicating with the public, we want to avoid these phrases. So internally, this phrase is commonly used. So we talk about targeted funding or targeted conservation or targeted watershed initiatives. And internally, that phrase is fine, but it has a much more threatening connotation to farmers and landowners. So you want to kind of frame these practices that or acres that are identified by ACPF as opportunities to consider rather than problems that are targeted that need to be solved. So, alternatively, you could use priority acres or precision conservation or enhanced outreach. So you just kind of want to make sure to kind of steer clear of that when communicating to the public. And finally, we just want to highlight that this non-prescriptive approach of ACPF is really important to emphasize to folks when we're communicating to folks in the watershed. The ACPF truly does identify options that are available that can be customized to fit the needs of each watershed or individual. And Joe's analogy of the ACPF cafe really resonated with me. So the ACPF provides the menu, conservation staff takes the orders, technical service providers are the culinary experts or the chefs, and the farmers enjoy their meal to their liking. So maps can be customized to fit the priorities and preferences of a watershed community or at the field scale. So now I'm going to kind of go into, first question, or a question for you is sort of what sort of preparation or planning or engagement needs to happen, you think needs to happen before running the ACPF? And I found my chat box so I can see what everybody says. And again, we can have these discussions in our small groups when we have them as well. So just food for thought, sort of what preparations or plannings do you think would be appropriate before running the ACPF? List stakeholders, gauge staff awareness and comfort with the ACPF. I think that's a great one. Great. So now we're going to kind of go on to a couple different examples of how the ACPF has been used. So this example you may be familiar with. So this is from Iowa, and that Carl had shared with this. This first map is at a watershed scale, and its use was sort of used to develop the watershed plan. So this is a very there's a lot of conservation practices on here. It's a somewhat technical map that may be sort of challenging for the public or for a public audience to see or really comprehend. So I would recommend that this audience would be for conservation partners and community leaders who are involved in the planning process. And then he was also able to share this next map, which is the same map at the watershed scale, but is sort of focused, and they've highlighted different priorities. So the practices that are on this second map are the bioreactors, the saturated buffers, and a couple different others. And it was really just a little bit more palatable for public consumption, and it's more appropriate for public meeting, and sort of has focused those priorities to help folks understand sort of where they're at and what exactly we're focusing on. So kind of talking about some of these extracurricular uses, this is a really great opportunity to put people's fields within the context of the watershed. It also enables folks to have some sort of pre-planning understanding of the watershed and what practices are sort of ideal, or what practices the ACPF has cited for particular acres, which can then help direct sort of enhanced outreach. So this second map is again at the watershed scale, and this is a map from Minnesota. And again, this plan, or this watershed map can be used for plan implementation. It's at a reasonable scale that is safe or comfortable for public consumption, and is also aesthetically understandable for the public. So it's not too crowded, and it does highlight 4 or 5 different practices. But this type of map could also be used even more targeted, or excuse me, more specific practices within the watershed. So in the second map, it is again at the watershed scale, used for plan implementation, and would be again used for public use, but is also sort of more focused. The white dots on this map are WASCOBs. So if there was somebody who was particularly interested, or a group that was particularly interested in WASCOBs, you would be able to customize this map and share that with them. And as you can see, this map is also a portion of a watershed. So the scale of the map is also can be customized as well. So again, this kind of allows people to sort of put their watershed or their area, their field within the context of the watershed, provides important information for conservation staff to be able to sort of help increase the efficiencies of their work, and allows them to sort of have enhanced outreach. So this next map is a field scale map that I would say would be used for both conservation plan development at a field scale as well as implementation. And this is kind of where we kind of talk a little bit about privacy and field verification. So this map is of a field, and you want to make sure that this information is sort of done or is shared with the landowner and not with the public. There's not, this is a scale that would be just for individual use. And in terms of field verification, you can see here the thick black line are existing practices. So if somebody were to go out here and talk with this landowner about implementing some of these practices, they would understand what practices are already on the field, and then also have an understanding of the practices the ACPF has cited for this field. So another sort of field scale map, which is used for plan development and implementation, can also be used to discuss multi-landowner projects. And I put an asterisk by these because this is really kind of where some of the local context comes in. So for example, let's say, so this is section 22 in a watershed. Let's say the top half of the section is owned by one person and the bottom half of the section is owned by another. It would be important to kind of understand the relationship that those two landowners have with each other, and sort of be able to observe some of the information you can gather from this map. Like the more northern landowner doesn't have any practices on his field, while the bottom one does. Is that important? I don't know. Hopefully the people on the ground would understand that. But this map could be used to talk with these landowners to sort of open the door or identify opportunities for a multi-landowner project. But we also do want to keep the privacy of those folks under consideration and sort of be cognizant of that. So just kind of to give a little overview, at the watershed scale, planning, development, and implementation, these kind of maps would be appropriate or are good examples of that, used in public planning or public meetings, planning, or an individual setting. They can kind of provide that watershed context. It can direct outreach and can also give planners important information before they go out into the field. And then these types of maps, field scale maps, to inform development of plans, as well as to implement those plans. That can be used planning at an individual or small group setting. So again, when you're dealing with maps or you're sharing with maps that are at a smaller scale, you want to be cognizant of some privacy concerns, and you also want to make sure that these maps are field verified. And thank you for that. I see I've got a couple of questions. I will happily answer those. And next up, Jess is going to share some information about how to design these maps and sort of how to format these maps to kind of make sure that they are at the scale and sort of communicating the information that you want to communicate. So thanks, everybody.
Great job. Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Nelson. I am going to be your pilot. It's going to be kind of a turbulent ride. We're going to start off in PowerPoint, looking at some cartographic features, and then like key themes to be thinking about when you're designing your maps, and then looking at some examples and kind of what works and what doesn't work, and then go into ArcMap itself and look at some of the tools that can help you filter some of those data sets. And make maps that make sense and aren't distracting, and help provide some credibility to the message you're sending to your landowners or whatever decision makers you're working with. So I will start sharing, and here we go. So to reiterate, we're going to talk a little bit about building map products with ACPF data. A little background about me is that I have been working with ACPF since probably about 2015 in southern Minnesota, working with so in conservation district offices, NRCS staff, state staff, and a lot of farmers. And we had a core group of citizens who would help review the data products and kind of tailor some of it to what made sense to them and what they think would make sense to their neighbors when we were talking about sub-watershed projects and developing plans. And so we had a little bit of bumper boats through there, kind of like how to design these things. And then also Dave James and Robin McNeely, who are here today, have helped a lot while we're developing those materials and expanding out ACPF nationally. So we'll see some of those products today. So while I'm talking today and while we're doing the activity later, some things to always keep in your brain is who is the audience and what is the objective for these maps. And if you can really hone in on that, it'll help you from adding too much data or not enough data, and thinking about labeling and how you design your legends. I think it's easy to fall into the trap of putting too much information on the map. But if you have like your objective or your kind of what you want people to see, that'll help narrow things down. So some basic kind of cartographic considerations. One of the top ones is your geographic bounds. At what scale are you presenting this data? Is it regionally? Is it at Huck 8, Huck 12? Are you really just looking at a drainage district or one field? Depending on that scale will determine how much data layers you can put in and then how thick the width should be, and kind of your layering or sequencing of everything. Another thing with geographic bounds is the size. So looking at the scale, this is the relationship between the size of the map and the size of Earth it is describing. So we'll typically see it as the 1 in 100,000 when you're in ArcMap or ArcPro, or 1 in 1,000, depending on how fine you're trying to get. And then generalization, the process of making decisions as to which features are included or not included on map. And so what I was kind of saying before is what really needs to be on that map and what's going to answer our questions. And kind of what's your end product? Are you creating an electronic document that's going to be distributed through email or published online for people to just click on? And so maybe you just want to publish a PDF, or is this going to end up on ArcGIS online and more interactive so folks can engage with it? And then kind of cartographic concepts get very convoluted, and you can zoom in and out and display features at different scales. And so that makes it a little trickier, or you have to be more thoughtful about how you're approaching it. Another consideration is you're doing printed handouts. In that case, you'd want not a lot of information and as zoomed in as possible, so it's easy for people to navigate on there. And maybe some space for folks to write on too, if you're doing a community meeting and wanting to get feedback on where they think conservation practices should go. Or you're creating a big poster and you're going to bring it out to the field and put it out on the hood of your car and kind of point at things and navigate the watershed to field verify some practices. And also a really effective way to relay this information is through PowerPoint and just having a sequence of maps on there. And so kind of thinking about what your end product is important for your layers, to include how big to make it, and then also like continuity. You want their consistency across all of your features. You don't want your streams labeled. If you're like showing a map atlas or a map series, you want all your streams to be the same color, all your field boundary widths to be the same, your watershed boundary to be the same color, and just make it really easy for your landowners or your stakeholders to be able to follow your story along, and not have to think too hard because it's already a lot of information to process. And then what is the key background data elements to include? Too much information can dilute the actual message, and too little information can make the message fall flat. So what is the correct combination of data to include? Sometimes roads can be really distracting here in this image. So maybe you don't want to include that. But if you need it for orientation purposes, when you're driving out, then maybe you do. So again, what's your objective? Same with streams or cities. It's kind of nice to have cities on there as landmarks. Some of the producers I work with really enjoy seeing the section, township, range on there, because that's kind of how they operate in their day-to-day. Some more things, are there existing conservation practices out there? Do you have a data layer that can illustrate or point out where easements exist, or previous implementation efforts have been conducted, or protected areas? Your symbolization, this is, I think we've all worked with symbology. If we've worked in ArcMap, is just defining the color, the line weights, the shape of the features, to use an icon, like these live trees, or would you just use a point or a diamond? Just kind of thinking about what gets the message across without being too distracting. Same with what I kind of mentioned before, one-off maps versus map books with the series. Just make sure you stay consistent. And there's plenty of color scheme planning and guidance on websites that I've tapped into, and I can send links to that if people are curious to kind of what colors complement each other, or if you're trying to be colorblind conscious, how to make sure that those individuals are able to read the map too, and it's not just all gray to them, but things pop out a little bit better. Labels and text, things to think about is what needs to be labeled individually and what you can get away with labeling only in the legend. What I mean by that is like the stream reach here, this blue line. Sometimes it's nice to have it labeled in the map so they know what stream reach it is, but there's already a lot of labeling like there is in this map. Do you really need to have it there? And would it just suffice to have stream reach in the legend and not worry about which what the specific name is called for it? Same with like bodies of water and city names. Is it just more important to know that there's a city there or a stream as opposed to the specific title for it? And so some things for the finished product to think about is your map title is always the largest font. These are just kind of general guidelines for handouts at like a 8.5 by 11, 16-point font, any text on the face of the map, 10 to 14. Any text in the margins, a smaller scale, 10 points. And then, sorry, footnotes are always the smallest. And so this is a screenshot of what, when you're working in ArcMap, kind of looks like for your labels. There's a lot of customizability in here. If you're labeling features, you can choose which field within the attribute table to do label in the map. And then once we get into ArcMap, I'll show a little bit about these placement properties, scale range, label styles, and just kind of some things I think about when I'm trying to display ACPF. The legends. Legends are key to deciphering the symbology on the map. This is what ties everything together and makes things more meaningful. And so how you have your data labeled is super important, and not labeling in a clear way. And also that resonates with your landowners. And one of the watersheds I worked in, they didn't necessarily like WASCOB. The people, their audience would understand CP 638. They got the NRCS code better. And same with grass waterways, they wanted it to be filter strips. And so they just, their audience, that's how they wanted it to be illustrated. And then they would go in and explain what it really meant. And so everything needs to be easy to read and relatable. Another thing to think about, and I'll show an example of this, is your units. Are they appropriate? Are they understandable? Does your audience work in meters versus feet versus centimeters? Or are they kind of thinking about things in acres? A lot of the ACPF outputs are, you have the some of them are in acres, some of them are in the metric units. And so just being cognizant of what you're displaying in your data, and is it meaningful to your intended audience to relay your message. Some things within the legend properties that just kind of drive me nuts is I always uncheck add a new item to the legend and reorder the legend items because it can just blow things up. And there's another window in there where you can, I'll show this later, but you can tell it to only include information in the legend that is relevant to that screenshot. So map layout, your choice in map orientation, portrait versus landscape. So what shape is your watershed? This one's in portrait. If it is a wider map, maybe I'd want it in landscape. And then placement of map elements for your insets and how much detail to put in there. Where do you put your legend? So just try to maximize information and reduce white space without it being too cluttered looking. So this is from a Freeborn Lake water management plan, and this is kind of what we tailored the final product to look like for that management plan. Make sure to include your scale bar and your north arrow so people can orient themselves. These locator maps are incredibly helpful if you're working in a big area. In this case, it's a set of 3 Huck 12 watersheds, and you kind of see where we are in Nebraska. And then peer review, seek advice from experienced cartographers, ask laypersons to interpret the map. Do things make sense? There's always somebody out there that can kind of provide guidance to help you be more understanding of what other people see. I think we get so invested in our final products that we forget about other people's perspective looking at it. So reach out to other peers. We have cohorts here through this watershed group, so we can kind of play off of each other. So getting into what data we're working with ACPF, and kind of away from using those cartographic concepts I've been discussing and applying it to ACPF. So the types of data we're working with are vectors, which are points, lines, and polygons. And then we're also working with raster layers. So this is kind of just a brief description of what a raster layer is. Each cell within that data set contains some sort of environmental measure, whether it's elevation, stream power, index value, or vegetation, just depending on what the data set is. And then there's also a lot of tables, like the drainage table has information for each field within your watershed of hydric, and an estimation percent hydric of the field, or what percent of the field is hydric, and then also if the field is estimated to be tile drained or not, depending on your inputs and the soils that are present at that site. And then just kind of what a raster property windows looks like in ArcMap. The main 2 windows you'd be working in is this display. If you want to mess around with transparency and kind of smoothing it out, and then symbology to change the color ramp to whatever, to add enough detail so you can distinguish different features from one another. I'll show you guys that in a second here. And then same in ArcGIS Pro, you access it differently, but it has the same options to display the data. Vector property window, working with symbology. There's a lot of different ways to display your data. One of the most common ones is through categories and choosing an attribute within the field to work with. And then same thing in ArcGIS Pro. So now we will take a look at some other maps. Let me get us out of there. So while I'll start off with just kind of some basic things. I think we've all seen a digital elevation model looking at the elevation data. This data set's actually in centimeters, and something I like to have my elevation layer here horizontal So I made an image from ArcMap and I just have that image saved, and then we'll make these calculations from centimeters to feet. So it's more understandable for my end user, and also it fits on the map a lot better. So if there's like a certain symbology that you really enjoy and want to include in your legend, you can always save that image and constantly use it so your products are always looking consistent and similar. So that's kind of a tip that I have for myself. And then with inset maps, this one is laid out as landscape because it's a larger area. We're honed in on the 703 here, but yeah, just kind of see similar features. Something to think about is like with general land use, this can get really bogged down and there could be a lot of colors in here. So thinking about what are the existing standards that NAS has out there. You don't have to reinvent the wheel for displaying colors and every time changing your symbology. So just be aware of existing color schemes that are standardized for kind of our field. And now I'm gonna hop into ArcMap. Another thing to do is kind of think about organize your data maybe thematically. For this project, we're citing all the practices and it's too much information to have on one map, all the practices. And so we organized them by impoundment, filtering practices, and then riparian zone management, as well as drainage. And so here's just kind of what a map document looks like for that in layout view. A couple things I want to note is that this is the intended output of this as a big poster that folks could take out to the field and kind of navigate their way around. And so important features with that was referencing where some cities are. And so we have a base layer in here for that. It's not going to show up super well with that white background. We also had aerial imagery on to just give a little more context. This is one of our base data elements, as well as roads. We might overwhelm my graphics drive right now because I have a lot of map documents open. Let's see if it'll go. Turn that one off. This is another consideration when you're building these maps is how fast is your internet? Sometimes it can take forever to load stuff. And so if you have things stored on a network drive, maybe you want it locally, so it'll pull up a little quicker. So here's what this map product looks like for their inset. We have nutrient removal wetlands out here. If you have something like this, where we have our practice highlighted with a drainage area to it, typically put a transparency on there so you can still see the topography below and kind of what the field looks like and the area it's covering. And so going in to nutrient removal drainage areas, properties, and at a 60% transparency, and that can really make a world of difference for when you're producing these products. Let's see. I don't have too much more time on this stuff, so I'll just go to the next one. This one is a busy map. For a poster scale, I would say that it works fine because it's going to get stretched out, but maybe if you're working at an 8.5 by 11, you would just want these contour buffer strips on their own and then display grass waterways and water and sediment control basins on there as an individual practice. But since our scale is so big, our map is so big, it can handle it a little better. And sometimes it looks deceiving, like these lines look really thick, but when you actually print it out, it thins out a little bit. And so it's important to do kind of a draft print before committing to the full thing. And so I'd like to print on 8.5 by 11 and see what it looks like. And also when you're working in the data view, like these lines just look really thick and chunky and like they're not gonna display well. It just looks like crayons on there. But once you start doing layout view, those thick lines make a big difference for line width. Okay, keep knocking them out. So now I might just kind of hop us into the watershed demo products. So something, just kind of when you get your ACPF data, I want to note, this is what it looks like. And so now we got to spend time building final products. Something to consider, I think is really important, is your watershed boundary. And so the boundary you're given is from the base watershed boundary data set. I'm going to see. And when you're running ACPF, you have an option to create a new watershed boundary. And so these tend to look a little different, and your drainage areas to your conservation practices are going to be more connected to your updated watershed boundary. And so when you're making maps, you want those things to match. I'll just make this line width a little bigger. So the red's the new, and the black is the standard, the national standard. So you get a new watershed boundary data set because you've hydromodified the landscape and you've updated your hydrology. And things like nutrient removal wetlands is one that really, in the riparian catchments, kind of shine light on some of the discrepancies between these. So if you were to use your base watershed boundary data set, and you were displaying your nutrient removal wetland here, it would kind of pop out of your watershed boundary. And so you might get questions about that information. And so when I'm making my final map products, I'll typically use my updated watershed boundary. So everything is more consistent and matches with one another. And if, let's see, and same here, just being kind of aware of what things are looking like. I think that's the biggest note there. So now I will hop into what we're going to be looking at this morning for the exercise. So we have 3 different watersheds that we'll be kind of practicing prioritizing and identifying which practices we want to use and why we chose them, if it's for pollutant information or is it for where they fall within the watershed. And we have a little bit more guidance on that. So I'll just go over maybe the maps we're going to be looking at. Watershed 1 is looks like this. There's one kind of altered waterway going through here with a little bit of turn, so a drainage ditch. This is located in southern Minnesota. And I think while we're looking at this map, I want you guys to note the legend here. So I want the final map product and where the inset map and the logo and my scale bar and my north arrow to be consistent as possible. I don't want my map to be moving around when I'm doing a series here of a blank map and then a map that has conservation practices in it. And so when I turn those conservation practices back on, I get another legend and I just drop this down and then put a divider line between there. And now it's kind of, there's some consistency across the board. Everything's in the same place, so the end user doesn't have to dart around trying to figure out like where stuff is, because I think the instinct is to make this smaller and then expand the map bigger, but sometimes it's nice to be able to look at one point and continue looking at it as you page through. And so we selected some conservation practices that are kind of easily quantifiable on the back of the napkin about some nutrient load reduction estimates, and then filtered through all the ACPF data to highlight some of those practices. And so we're looking at water and sediment control basins. It'll look better in here. Water and sediment control basins, grass waterways, depressions, and then nitrogen bioreactors, and evaluating what they look like, or which ones we want to get after, And then also thinking about what these maps look like and do they look good to you? Do they look bad to you? Thinking about how these labels are displayed on there. That's always kind of a battle is, let's see. Like with the WASCOBs, I put a halo on it because that pink color doesn't show up super well. And so I'll just show it without the halo or the mask. That's what it looks like without it. And in some spots it doesn't pop as well. And so I added a mask so that I could see it would pop out a little bit more. Some colors just don't cooperate so much. Oops. This is where we get turbulent. Sorry guys, if I'm moving too quick. And then other things, I think the green color looks okay, but sometimes I'll put a black halo behind it depending on what my background is. And there's a lot of ways to tweak. And if you guys ever have maps that you want another set of eyes on, myself, where I throw Dave under the bus and Robin under the bus, I'm sure we'd be happy to review some of these products. We've spent a lot of time making them, and there's so many little nuanced details. And once you like know who your audience is and what your objective is, I think things you can really focus in on these features. Let's see, something like placement properties. I have removed duplicates here. Some of the features will add duplicates in like the grass waterways, because I combine them if they're in the same field. And yeah, do you want to put it within the polygon, outside of the polygon, and there's conflict resolution, and so adding a little bit of space between there, so that your features, like my depression labels, aren't bumping into my grass waterway layers. And it's just kind of a lot. It's an iterative process. I don't have like a clean way to say that should be these numbers, but just to show you that these exist. And it's just kind of try this, okay, apply, and then things will bump around a little bit. And so we have 3 of these watersheds. They're all in a different location, and we're gonna break you guys out into some groups to review them. I'll note, I guess, the fun one I think is watershed 3. So if you end up in this group, you guys are in for a real treat. One of the layers in here is a public drainage system. And so it has a part open ditch and then also some public tile mains going through there, and they drained a giant lake for farming. And it's also like something interesting to think about. In the state of Minnesota, we have vulnerable drinking water source areas. And so some of our fields have restrictions on fertilizer they can put out there. And so they're trying to reduce the amount of nitrogens running off. And so that's these green blobs. And then also just where existing easements are. Oh, this is the one, I think when I figured this legend thing out, this was kind of revolutionary. So this layer has environmental conservation BMP locations, has just an insane amount of options on there because it's looking at the whole data set for the state of Minnesota. And I don't have fish management or feedlot relocation within my space that I'm looking at. And so you can go into the legend and then at items, select that layer and they say show only classes that are visible in the current map extent. And so every time you're moving through the map, it's going to change that because it's looking at your current extent, but it's not necessarily going to have that whole thing. So you don't have to make room for all like 100 or more of those designations here, which can be a real game changer. And I might stop sharing this. I think I'm going a little over time, sorry. And then I can introduce where we're headed and why we're headed there. Guess I gotta keep sharing. So we're looking at Watonwan River Watershed, Minnesota, which is a Huck-8 watershed. It is one of the top polluters in our state. It's It's pretty high for, yeah, total nitrogen, total suspended sediments, and total phosphorus. And so it's something that I worked closely with to develop some watershed plans using ACPF with them. Primarily corn and soybeans with an extensive river system. I would say 60% or more of the watershed is altered hydrology and has been drained to connect a series of wetlands so that it is more farmable. And so it's, yeah, looking in the prairie pothole region, and there's a lot of potholes that like to hold water, and that's not so useful for when you're trying to farm. Okay, so with this, I'll turn that down a little bit. When we're thinking about planning and our priority resource concerns, the top ones are nitrogen, nitrates, phosphorus, restored hydrology, sediment. Also, if you're looking at protection and looking at wildlife habitat management. I don't have a map for that right here, but these are kind of some of the top things that they identified in their watersheds. And so I guess we're gonna throw it out to you. What are your primary resource concerns within your watershed? And so a little feedback so you guys can quit listening to me talk and see what you guys have to say about your own watersheds. There's the chat. Where are you located, Jean and Judy? Solid reactive phosphorus. Yeah, that can be a problem. Central Illinois. Northwest Ohio. Cool. You guys can, yeah, keep adding those. I've heard some interesting things. We sent out a survey in Minnesota to see what people's concerns are and gave them an other option. And something people said was like how to drain more wet areas is what one of the conservation districts said, so that they can improve yields within their county. And so that was, yeah, different perspective than what I typically expect. Pervious runoff. Is it pretty, Katie, is that a pretty heavily populated watershed? Okay, yeah, they got some great areas. Okay, and now we kind of want to spin it around and be like, ask what you think your landowners would be their priority resource concerns. Would they have the same ones as you guys, or do you find that they have other things they're prioritizing when they're making their land management decisions? I think for me, some of the farmers I worked with always was, yeah, many landowners want more tile. They want to improve their drainage. I thought was a big one, but not necessarily. I think some of the guys I worked with, they want to improve their drainage, but they also would want to put a storage. They thought everyone should have a 1 acre storage basin on their field. And so that was, for one of the Huck 12s I worked in, we developed a map where we could visualize those outputs. Yeah, that's true, Tyler. Landowner profitability. Nutrient loss is important for farmers because it's a waste of money, but they're primarily concerned with their yields, of course. Yeah, it's a tough balance, and every year is so different. For today's exercise, we're trying to prioritize most of these pollutant loads. And so I chose a couple watersheds within the red and orange. We're going to be, let's see, looking at 2 watersheds up in this more northeast portion, and then 1 watershed in this more centralized location. And I'll just kind of go back and show us like restored hydrology. We did the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency did a survey of all the water bodies within the state to kind of estimate which ones are altered and which ones are still natural. And so it's just kind of interesting to see that, and they tend to be kind of erosive areas too. Okay, so I'll mosey on over to ArcMap. And we already looked at those watersheds. I think now maybe Emily will hop into getting them separated and try to pull up the Excel and image, or do you want to pull up the Excel and image?
Sure.
Okay. Either way.
Quick.
I'm a rambler, so sorry guys. Thanks for coming on that bumpy ride with me.
That was great. It's always nice to kind of see how the sausage is made, you know, as they say.
Yeah, I feel like 15 minutes isn't, or 20, I guess I'm talking for 35, but it's just, I could spend hours staring at symbology and trying to get it all to lay right and ordered appropriately.
All right, so I'm going to share my screen here. So for this, does everybody see that? All right.
Looks good.
So for this exercise, we're going to separate everybody into 4 groups. We're focusing on 3 watersheds. So group 3 and group 4 are going to be focusing on the same watershed, which is the watershed that Jess had just focused on. So those folks will be talking about the same one. But yeah, so in your participants folder, there is a folder called session 3. So mosey on over to that folder. In each of these documents will be assigned, everyone will be assigned groups. Click on your group to get your document. It'll include one PDF file that has some instructions. So everybody identify a note taker who can sort of document what you guys are discussing. And then these are some discussion questions. So we're going to kind of ask you guys what objectives you want to prioritize and why. So some of those objectives, like Jess had mentioned, could be restoration, protection, nutrient loss, sediment, or others, if you guys can think of others. So all of these practices are ranked. Let me also get to this. So the other document in these folders is an Excel file. And that Excel file includes all of the practices that are identified identified by ACPF. So it gives each BMP has an ID. You get some information about those practices. And then we have an estimated annual pollutant removal rate. So again, this is sort of a back of the napkin thing and is for demonstration only, but it kind of quantifies some of the nutrient loss potential for these practices. And you can kind of see the size. You'll also be able to sort of connect the practice and its loss potential to the practice on the map. So this is the Excel sheet. And each of these PDF documents includes the questions, and it has a blank map that is just information about the watershed. So it's just got the stream reach and the watershed boundaries. And then it also has a demo map, which includes the practices that the ACPF has identified. So each of these BMPs is labeled, and you can then look at the map and kind of see where those practices are, look at the Excel file, look at the Excel sheet, and sort of be able to see sort of its impact. And that can help you prioritize some of those practices. So we're asking you to identify 10 practices that would be your top priority. And I think some of the other groups also have an existing practice map, so you can kind of use that information as well. This watershed one does not, but that's okay.
They didn't have any existing.
No existing. So that's great information to also consider. So yeah, I think we can, does anybody have any questions about this activity before we begin? I think we'll be kind of popping in, kind of make sure things are going well, and we'll be in these groups for about 10 minutes. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, I can answer them now, or we'll be kind of popping in throughout to see if anybody needs any assistance. And then we'll come back together and kind of ask for your observations, sort of what you decided were your practices and which practices you prioritize, why, and sort of that thought process that you guys went through to sort of get this. And again, this is just a demonstration, so it's okay. It's a back of the napkin kind of morning.
Yeah, I think the intent is to really have you guys think about your own watershed. Are you going to choose, if you're working with ACPF, what's going to be your kind of qualifiers for pursuing conservation practices that they're, or limitation, like if it's a giant wetland restoration, it could have like really great wildlife benefits, nutrient reduction benefits, but you're going to be working with 7 landowners, and like a third of them are going to be wildly difficult to work with. So just kind of like pairing those nutrient reduction benefits with the size of the practice and the area treated, and also like the social dynamics within your watershed are kind of, important things to consider.
Yeah, and that's sort of the pre-planning information that we had talked about was important. So just kind of, I know most of you are probably not that familiar with these watersheds in particular, but you certainly can use insights that you've observed throughout your experience in your own watershed. So I think
I will go ahead and open the rooms. I did try to pair folks off in states. So we have an Ohio group, Nebraska, Illinois, and then Indiana. And Jess, Emily, Rebecca, and Marcel, I put one of you in each room.
excellent.
Cool, thank you.
And the links to these practices or to these folders are in your participant folder. And the link to that folder is at the top in the chat.
All right, great.
All
I was
right.
here 10 minutes, Emily, but that seemed really short to me. I don't know. You guys can decide. I'm happy to put you back in. It's up to you.
Well, I mean, what do we want to go back in? I know like group 1 was just kind of getting into some really important discussions that were going on. But I do want to respect everybody's time. We have about 20 minutes left.
Yeah, and we want to make sure we give time for Dave to talk about the hub and the future and all of that. So if we can, I think if we just as a large group, what do we observe and what do you want to do next as you look at these would be some good discussions. And then about 10:40, 10:45, we'll start doing some wrap up. Great. So I think that we can just kind of, as groups, the 4 groups, the note taker can kind of share what you have found, share some questions that you may have, some assumptions that you made, sort of help you make your decisions. And I know this is kind of a tough task, not knowing a lot of information or not having that local knowledge of the area. But yeah, thanks everybody. And let's just kind of hear what each group had to say. So group 1, our Ohio folks.
Okay, thanks. So we, as the Ohio group, we focused our priority was nutrient loss reduction. That's very important in our region. So depending on what area of Ohio, phosphorus and or nitrogen. So that's what our priority impairment was. And then looking at the practices in our initial discussion, we looked at grass waterways was our first choice because on the load reductions, it was most impactful for total phosphorus. And then we also included as our second choice, we started looking at the wascobs because they also had an impact on phosphorus and total nitrogen. So that's we specifically tailored it to our which we're going to hit one or both of our nutrient impairments. And then some important assumptions when we didn't get necessarily to cite all 10 of our practices, but what we started talking, important assumptions would be that we had cooperative landowners, which is a huge assumption, but then also the capability to carry out in terms of funding and such. So those were a couple assumptions that we looked at, and we were starting to get some good discussion. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Bowden. And I thought some of the interesting discussions or observations that I made in our map, there was a 40-acre wetland, and there was a lot of questions, like how productive is this land? How many landowners are there? So all of this kind of information is important to sort of kind of suss out and understand sort of the limitations of some of these issues. So thank you, group one. Group two, what do you think?
So we just kind of got into question one, and that's about all we talked about. But kind of our question was is what's the impairment, and that typically drives where the money's coming from. So what money are we able to use to solve this issue, and you know, what's really the issue, and what are the stakeholders and landowners, operators willing to do or not willing to do. That's all we got. So.
I think that's a great point, Ryan. Implementing these practices on private lands requires the input and, you know, acceptance of those private landowners. So it's a great point. Group three, what do you think?
Our discussion, we did choose nutrient loss as a priority, and we spent a lot of time actually just trying to interpret the map and catch up to kind of what the landscape might look like there, you know, making, like we made the comment, it'd be really nice to have a topo map to go along with this so we understood the landscape. And there was a lot of, but we assumed, you know, it was very wet and relatively flat. It's the one where they like drained a pond or a lake, and there's drainage all over the place. But anyway, I think we didn't really get into actually ranking, but a few observations on the potential practices were not a lot of bioreactors. So we weren't sure about, you know, tile drainage opportunities. And also there was a lot of, you know, wetland restoration opportunities. Some of them were really large, and kind of thinking, you know, if we were working with landowners, maybe prioritizing some of the smaller ones. So we were not asking a farmer to give up his entire field to create some sort of wetland. But generally speaking, you know, just I think our discussion underscored the value or the need to do some ground truthing. So you really understood what the landscape was before you could communicate it to any landowner or any stakeholders in the watershed.
Great, thanks, Jean. I think again, those are great observations and great takeaways from this practice. And group four. So group four had the same watershed as group three. So we'll see if they sort of came up with similar observations.
Well, thank you for saying that we had the same watershed as group three, because I kind of had this like, we were looking at the wrong map. So, okay, good. So we looked at that map as well, and we decided to manage nutrient loss because of, you know, with the low-lying landscape, there's probably a lot of tile drainage, so a lot of nutrient loss. Soil loss was probably going to be less of an issue, at least in that area. And so we started to talk about looking at things like wetland restoration, saturated buffers, bioreactors, things like that. And I admittedly spent a good couple minutes at the start of our discussion in awe of Jessica's cartography and really talking about how helpful that was. So I'm sorry we didn't get much farther.
No worries, no worries. I think you're right. Jessica is I've called her an ACPF wizard, and I believe that she's also a map wizard as well. Yeah, so thanks for participating. And I think that 10 minutes is a short amount of time to do this sort of prioritization exercise. But I think that everybody kind of was able to sort of understand sort of the elements that these maps included and be able to sort of help start that prioritization process and sort of understanding what goes into it, what considerations. And I think that there's been a lot of really good observations by our four groups. So it looks like we are ready to move on to sort of our closing time. So thanks, everybody.
Let's unmute. Hi, thank you. Thank you, Emily and Jessica. That was really great to try that out and look at all the different mapping options. So just by way of summary of what you've been hearing in these 3 sessions, if you want to implement ACPF more in your, whatever your area is, you need different kinds of expertise, the ArcGIS expertise and the local knowledge expertise. You need a bunch of time. You need time to train the GIS specialists. For a single Huck 12, it takes 2 or 3 days to do the hydro modification, run the ACPF tools, And then a bunch more time to do what we were all talking about today, go back and forth and deciding what do we actually need these maps to do? What information do we need to pull out? You need the software. You need ArcGIS Pro with Spatial Analyst extension. This isn't the cheap version. This is the full version. And so that's an issue for some entities. And you need some support resources. You need the people to network with and learn from. And so that's all the different things you'll be thinking about as you move on and try and take this home and apply it to what you're doing. And so a lot of you within your state, you're going to be continuing these conversations. And I'm hoping these are the questions you'll be talking about. You know, what can ACPF do to advance our work? How does ACPF link to the programs and tools we're currently using? Where is the technical capacity in our state to run the ACPF? And what are the gaps in the resources? Where do we need time and, you know, the people power? Where's the funding? Where are the skills? What are the skills that we have and don't have? So what are those gaps in resources that are preventing implementation of ACPF, and how can we fill those? What are the partnerships we should be focusing on strengthening? And how can we leverage and contribute to the national work at the ACPF hub? Now, how can we organize at a state level and then link that with the national level work? And that leads into our final speaker, David James, who is at this national hub, has been working on ACPF since the very beginning and helped create, you know, the programming. He's behind the programming of the ACPF from the very beginning. And he's going to take a few minutes to talk about what the thinking is at the national level. Dave, I'll hand off to you.
Thank you, Marcel. Let me start sharing my screen. And, oh. Come on, start. There we go. Yes, I suspect that some of you know me. I'm one of the original developers of the ACPF, which has now exploded well beyond our imagination. Mark Tomer and I, along with Sarah Porter, began this many years ago. And to see it come to this kind of use is extremely gratifying and critically remarkable. And we're happy to, you know, to see this happen. So one of the upshots of this has been getting the NRCS to notice the potential benefit for the ACPF, and we've worked with them, and they found it in their funding opportunities to essentially fund essentially a formalization of what we've been doing in the past. You know, up until just recently, I've been responsible for managing the database, and you know, Mark and I have been on the stump, if you will, promoting the ACPF, you know, writing papers, doing presentations, along with the support of all the other fine folks that you've been talking to today. And so they've decided to fund the what we're calling the ACPF National Hub. They've also funded a couple other projects. I'll talk about those in a second. But and you've seen enough about the ACPF now. I'm not going to go into anything about what the ACPF is anymore. But you know, you can look at the map now and see that we extend across, you know, much of the Midwest. The National Hub intends to begin to broaden the scope of the ACPF, both geographically and programmatically. I think that one of the key things is that Mark and I realized, and well, of course, and Sarah as well, that each landscape is different. You know, each watershed is different. Each field is different. And so, you know, our initial efforts to build out the toolbox, and you can see over there on the right-hand side, there's 30 some odd tools, more if you look at the utilities already in the ACPF toolbox. And so they're not all going to work everywhere. We understand that. And we wanted to be able to have a foundation where we could build upon that. And that's what the National Hub purports to do. And by the way, he'll be looking down upon us from, or actually up above from us in New Zealand. That's Mark Tomer there. He moved to New Zealand last week. And so we're hoping that once he gets out of quarantine, that he'll be able to begin to communicate with us once again, and he'll be able to continue to support us as we go forward with our effort, although at a reduced rate. So here's kind of some of the overarching goals and objectives of the hub, but it really isn't any different than what we've already done in the past. You know, we've developed the data structure and the toolbox, and you know, we've been doing training. Now we're going to formalize that. We're going to bring more people to bear on this issue, and we're going to have an opportunity to expand both the database, but also the toolbox. And like you've been able to take advantage of so far through the outreach and training process and program, we're going to be able to reach out and inform more people about the ACPF and conservation planning opportunities that the ACPF will facilitate. My hope is that we'll see this, you know, generate more interest, and like-minded people will be able to come together and begin to, again, broaden the scope both geographically and programmatically for doing a more efficient job of conservation planning and seeing improvements in soil health and water quality and other things. So the National Hub right now is going to be initiated with basically 3 teams, if you will. The admin team is going to take care of, you know, the programmatic stuff, doing project management, all the stuff that we have to do with regard to the NRCS. The technical team is going to support the database, the tools, understanding how we're going to process data. One of the things that we're going to add to the ACPF mix, if you will, is the opportunity to share results. You know, up until now, we've simply shared the data, the core data and the toolbox, and provided training and support. What we want to do is we want to open up the data structure to allow for people to, well, first of all, if they build out the database in their states and it's not in our database, we'd offer them the opportunity to contribute that data, and we would take it and review it and make sure it's all good, and then we would put it up on our database for other people to use. More importantly, maybe, is the opportunity to share ACPF results. One of the things we want to do is develop a workflow that's going to allow us to accept contributions from people who have run the ACPF. And then what we envision is that we'll be sharing the results, the actual feature classes and rasters and so on and so forth, through ArcGIS Online, so that anybody could access those data and use them in their conservation plan. And again, we're going to continue to pursue our outreach program and training to bring the message, if you will, of ACPF to a broader audience, and expand our reach, if you will. Over on the right, you can see a couple of other bullets there. One of the things we want to do is start reaching out to individual states or regions and the stakeholders there that are interested in the ACPF and work with them to bring their users together, if you will, to examine how ACPF might be used in their state. And then we got, I spoke of the two projects that have also been funded. One is through the ARS in St. Paul. That will be a tool development process. We're going to work with SEEP scientists in the ARS organization to identify research-based tools that we might be able to bring into the toolbox, and then work through trying to figure out how to develop those tools and get them integrated into our structure. And also here at Iowa State University, working with Emily Zimmerman and John Tyndall, we're going to be developing what we call the ACPF economics tool that's going to allow us to bring some cost benefit analyses to the ACPF toolbox. Both of these two projects are just starting up. There will be, for those of you that are in the cohort training, there'll be an opportunity to listen to Emily talk about the economics tool here in the upcoming days. I think other folks are going to be invited as well. One of the keys to this whole effort is going to be reaching out to the state and regional stakeholders and other users. We've envisioned the hub and spoke model as kind of a framework for doing this. We want to see interested folks come together in their local areas and make sure that we bring resources to bear on those opportunities for those folks to use the ACPF and build out even better data and tools for their use. Again, one of the things that we're looking forward to is developing a user community that's going to allow us to share our successes and challenges, of which there are many, using the ACPF. So Rick Cruz and Emily Zimmerman are the PI and the co-PI for the ACPF Hub. Please reach out to them or me. I'm retired, but still actively engaged. If you have questions, want to start talking about developing user group, or just have general questions and need support. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dave. Appreciate that. Do people have questions for Dave and where this is going and how different resources that you need as you step out into this world of ACPF?
Just a note that I know Dave mentioned the economic tool that's currently in development, and you all should have received an email yesterday with the invitation to that, just to learn more if you wanted to sit in on that conversation.
In the next, very soon, you should see a link in your inbox to a feedback survey on this workshop. And we would really appreciate your observations and feedback and ideas of what your needs are looking forward. So that helps us a lot as we develop future outreach and training resources. Mark Wilson, when sharing ACPF results to the general public, please emphasize to the point of overemphasis, the practices reflect potential opportunities and are not prescriptive. ACPF results can easily be interpreted as obligations for landowners. That might be one of the biggest messages we'd like to get across here. It's really important. All right, well, thank you all for all your comments and participation in these last 3 days of workshops. And I hope you all have a really good afternoon. and look for more communications from us.